Good evening, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about baking soda, baking powder, and you'll get some elements of cream of tart in there, as well as some of these others that are in the background here. These are your normal staples inside most people's pantries. And let's talk about the first thing that comes to mind, baking powder. Now, a lot of people use this for baking and making pancakes and cakes and stuff. But do you really know what's in it? Well, I'll tell you what's in it. Baking soda, cream of tart, and cornstarch. So let's move on and talk about how it's considered a 2-in-1 chemical leavening because of the sodium bicarbonate from the baking soda, the cream of tart, and the combination of the cornstarch. It makes a chemical reaction, like I stated before. Carbon dioxide, it inflates cookies, cakes, and pancakes. But note it is very important to your batter or dough will not rise in the oven when it's being baked because of the treats that will be dense or not airy and kind of be really hard and flat because it won't rise. But if you say you don't have this in your pantry, or you ran out, well, what do you do now? Well, I have a solution for that. You can substitute other things for baking powder. One way to do it would be using buttermilk. Buttermilk is usually created from churning cream into butter. But it can be made, it's mostly made and manufactured commercially now. What they do is they take regular milk and they put bacterial cultures in it and allow it to ferment. That will break down the sugars into like an acidy material. So your milk or buttermilk becomes an acid. They'll also add probiotics and some flavorings to it because some people do drink buttermilk, believe it or not. So how can we use buttermilk to imitate baking powder? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to add baking soda to the buttermilk. The recipe for that would be a half a cup of buttermilk to a quarter teaspoon of baking soda. Now, these ingredients will be substituted for 1 teaspoon of baking powder. The next item that you can use to replace baking powder when you don't have it is yogurt. Plain yogurt has a very acidic pH, and it is a perfect substitute for baking powder when mixed with baking soda. Plain yogurt works best with other varieties because it provides acidity needed for leavening without adding flavor. That's very key when you're doing recipes, because you don't want to change the taste of your product. So the combination that you would need to make 1 teaspoon of baking powder would be a half a teaspoon of baking soda to a half a cup of plain yogurt. Mix it together and put it into your recipe. The other thing that you can use is molasses. Now, molasses can be used as a replacement also. This is because molasses is acidic enough to cause an acid-base reaction that you need when you combine it with baking soda. The recipe, if you want to use molasses, would be 1 cup of molasses to a quarter teaspoon of baking soda. And that will replace 1 teaspoon of baking powder. Now, in addition to reducing the amount of liquid To compensate for the added liquid from the molasses, you may want to consider reducing the amount of sweetener in the rest of the recipe also, because molasses is high in sugar. Now, the next substitution would be cream of tart. Remember, we talked about that. This and that and the cornstarch make this. But you can use cream of tart also. Now, you might wonder, well, what is cream of tart exactly? Well, cream of tart is an acidic white powder formed by the byproduct of winemaking. It's most commonly used to stabilize egg whites and creams, as well as to prevent the formation of sugar crystals in those items. It's easy and convenient to substitute for baking powder. All you'll do is 2-to-1 ratio of cream of tart to baking soda. The recipe for that would be 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda plus 1/2 teaspoon of cream of tart. That would be equivalent to 1 teaspoon of baking powder. Now, you can also use sour milk. Sour milk can replace baking powder too. Now, in the past, milk was usually spoiled. People allowed it to sit out in the warm air and allow it to spoil. But you can make your own sour milk rather than letting your milk sit out for a little while. How you would do that would you be adding 1 tablespoon of white vinegar or lemon juice to 1 cup of milk. Now, the vinegar and the lemon juice will lower the pH in the milk and making it sour. And in just over about 15 minutes, it'll be ready to use. Now, the recipe for making it equivalent to 1 teaspoon of baking powder would be 1/2 cup of sour milk, and you add 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. Now, remember, you got to reduce the amount of liquid when you're using this method in your recipe by the same amount that you add for extra fluid coming from the sour milk. Now, the next thing that you can use to substitute baking powder is vinegar. Everybody knows that vinegar has a strong, distinctive flavor, and vinegar is a common ingredient in many baked goods. In fact, the acidic pH of vinegar is perfect for use as a substitute for baking powder. It too has a leavening effect on your recipes. Now, the type of vinegar that would work best would be white vinegar because it is a most neutral taste and won't alter the color or the flavor of your recipe. Now, the recipe to use this combination would be 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda to 1/2 teaspoon of vinegar, and that will be equivalent to 1 teaspoon of baking powder. The next thing that you can use is lemon juice. Lemon juice contains a high amount of citric acid and is very acidic, and for this reason it could help trigger the acid-base reaction that you need with baking soda in your baked goods. However, because it is such a strong flavor, it's best to use in recipes that call for relatively small amounts of baking powder. This way you can avoid altering the taste of your recipe. To use this, you would need to add 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda to 1/2 teaspoon of lemon juice, and that would be equivalent to 1 teaspoon of baking powder. The next thing that you could use would be club soda. Club soda is a carbonated beverage. It contains sodium bicarbonate, but the amount of sodium bicarbonate that's found in club soda is minimal. So it's best to use in recipes that only require a bit of volume. Club soda is commonly used to create fluffy and moist pancakes, for example. For best results when you use club soda is to replace it with any liquid that's in your recipe, such as milk or water. And then you won't have to worry about having the baking powder to use. Now, the other alternative to baking powder would be using self-rising flour. Self-rising flour already has baking soda and baking powder in with the flour itself. So if you were going to use that particular item, you would substitute the self-rising flour for the normal flour in your recipe and omit putting either one of these into your recipe because it'll already be in there, so you don't really need it. The other thing that is also used to substitute for baking powder would be whipped egg whites. Many baked goods owe their light and airy texture to whipped egg whites rather than the baking powder, because this process of whipping an egg naturally puts tiny air bubbles into it and creates volume and lightness. This method is usually used in soufflés, pancakes, meringues, and certain types of cakes. One cake that I can tell you right now off the top of my head that uses egg whites instead of baking powder is angel food cake. Now, say you were going to make an angel food cake, you would have to have at least 12 egg whites whipped up to incorporate into your recipe. And if you were going to say use egg whites for your pancakes, instead of putting the whole egg in, you put egg whites in, you only need 2 or 3 egg whites whipped up into like a meringue type thing. Now, the best way to make egg whites perfect and fluffy is to beat them on a slow speed until they're foamy, and then increase the speed until the egg whites are beaten to soft peaks. Then you gently fold the egg whites into your recipe. Now, these substitutions are great when you're in a pinch, and take notice of the substitutions because they may add a change to the taste of your recipe. So keep all of that in mind when you run out of baking powder. The next item that I want to talk to you is baking soda. Now, yes, baking soda is a chemical leavener, just like baking powder is, because baking powder has baking soda in it. Baking powder is great to have when you have it, but sometimes you even run out of baking soda. So here's what you're going to do if you need to substitute baking soda when you run out. The first thing that you need to think about for substitution is baking powder. Like baking soda, baking powder has the ingredient frequently used in baking to promote rising and leavening in the final product. So why wouldn't you use baking powder if you have it and you run out of baking soda? Still, it's not going to be as strong for leavening as, say, plain baking soda. So you'll need a greater amount of baking powder to get the same effect for your recipe. Although the results may vary, you should triple the amount of baking powder that you would normally use with baking soda. For example, if the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of baking soda, you're going to use 3 teaspoons of baking powder as a replacement. But please take note that this recipe may be saltier than normal, so you may want to reduce the amount of salt in your recipe or totally omit it from the recipe if you're going to use baking powder for a substitute for baking soda. Now, the other thing that you can use to substitute for baking soda is potassium bicarbonate. This would be a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you're going to use 1 teaspoon of baking soda and you don't have baking soda, you can use 1 teaspoon of potassium bicarbonate. Yet, due to its low salt content in potassium bicarbonate, you may want to add additional salt to your recipe to make up for the saltiness that would normally have come from the baking soda. So roughly we're talking 1/4 teaspoon to 1/2 teaspoon of salt for every teaspoon of potassium bicarbonate that you're going to be using as a start. But keep in mind that you're going to have to experiment a little, because you got to get the same ratio as what would be equivalent to the baking soda alone. Now, the next substitute for baking soda would be baker's ammonia. It carries a historical significance, this particular item. It was the one main chemical leavening agent that they used in the 13th century, so it's been around for quite a while. But ultimately, baking powder and baking soda were replacements for baker's ammonia for modern baking practices, although it's occasionally still used today. Baker's ammonia is known for imparting a distinct crispness in baked goods, which is particularly desirable in some confections that are created, such as thin, crisp cookies or crackers. Baker's ammonia can be easily swapped for baking soda on a 1-to-1 ratio, but it may not be suitable for all recipes. Please keep this in mind. When combined with heat and acid, baker's ammonia produces carbon dioxide and ammonia. The ammonia can create a strong, unpleasant smell. In baked goods with a light, thin texture, the ammonia will easily dissipate without negativity affecting the result. I'm not one for using this because of what I just described, the ammonia. That would be something I don't think I really want to deal with. And the final substitution for baking soda is self-rising flour. As I said with baking powder, self-rising flour already has these 2 items in it, so you wouldn't have to do anything. Just substitute the self-rising flour for the regular flour, and you can omit both of these, and you're done. You have what you need to make your recipe. I hope this is helping my viewers and showing you the alternatives that you could use should you run out of either one of these. And I hope that it's going to help you when you do your cooking adventures. I will be returning in one more video talking about some staples that I have in my pantry that are or should be in yours. That would be cream of tart, cornstarch, and tapioca. So that's all I have for now. Good evening, everybody.